if we think about what it is that tells us where we are in time and space, it's history. That's our collective narrative. I believe deeply in deep democracy. And I don't define democracy as the ability to cast a vote in an election. I believe democracy is when societies are genuinely governed by the will of the people and when they have all the tools that they need to be engaged in the political process. And that includes access to information, and it includes a strong public education system, and so on. This book is really about democracy. It's about how democracy has systematically been sabotaged through the harnessing of shocks and crisis to bypass democracy. And that's the reason why I focus on the shock tactic. A state of shock is the gap that opens up between an event and your ability to understand that event. We exist in a time of serial crises. The occurrence and intensity of natural disasters are increasing. There seems to be no decline in resource wars, which means there will be no decline in blowback from those resource wars. We've built an economic system that creates systematically bubbles that then burst and create economic crises. This is what casino capitalism does. And we need strategies. We need political strategies for how we're going to respond to those crises. And my motivation in writing the book is precisely to make people more resistant to the shock doctrine. I see the book, I hope the book would be a kind of a shock shield in a way, precisely because these tactics are all about lack of information and disorientation. And when you have a political leadership that is deliberately intensifying that disorientation, what you need to get out of shock is a story, is a narrative that explains what's happening around you. And you know, that's why I wrote the book the way I wrote it. I write it as a story because I think we're bombarded with information. And so it isn't that we don't have facts, it's that we don't have the connections between the facts that make the facts make sense. And you know, in the book, and I guess probably the most controversial part of the book, I draw connections between what happens in torture under interrogation, where the prisoner loses their sense of where they are in time and space, and what happens to whole societies that have just lived through one of these shocks, where we lose our place, we lose our bearings, there's this kind of a collective vertigo that sets in after these moments. And like I said, from a North American perspective, September 11th is, you know, what people immediately think about when you describe this phenomenon, because they remember that feeling of collective regression, of thinking Rudy Giuliani was going to protect them, and they know what they lost in that moment. We remember that terrible mistake of thinking, yes, our leaders will protect us, and if they need more powers, we should grant them more powers, because after all, they only have our best interest at heart. I mean, people are now living with the legacy of that delegation of power and realize what a grave error that was. After September 11th, when this sort of new era opened up of armed robbery and what I'm calling disaster capitalism, our movements were not able to make a really clear connection between these resource wars and the economic model that we had been imposing on the streets. So two things happened. You had the people who were talking about trade and economics continued to talk about trade and economics, but sort of ignored the wars. And just didn't talk about Afghanistan, didn't talk about Iraq, didn't talk about the new homeland security economy, just focused on what they were always focusing on, and became less relevant to the public debate, because the public debate was about war and terrorism, and there needed to be a response. So that was on one side, and then the other side, a lot of people just said, look, the war is on, now we talk about war. We have an anti-war movement, and we don't need to talk about economics anymore. We just need to stop the war. And so these paths really didn't intersect, or they didn't intersect enough. And of course, there were many examples of groups that insisted on making those connections, and one of them is, you know, the group that we were supporting last night, Hands Off Iraq's Oil. But there weren't enough examples like that are making those connections clearly. And in the global South, because and particularly in Latin America, because there's an understanding that neoliberalism has always been a violent project. And I was in Argentina when the war in Iraq began, and I was at the anti-war marches in Buenos Aires, and what people were saying was, they're doing to Iraq what was done to us in the 70s, which is imposing this economic model through violence. The most inspiring examples of shock resistance often come from indigenous communities, which is, and in the book I talk about how it was indigenous communities in Thailand that were most able to resist the land grabs after the tsunami, and led a movement of reclaiming land through direct action, and the resistance to neoliberalism has actually been led by indigenous groups in Latin America, starting with the Zapatistas, who have a very clear story about where neoliberalism fits in within the narrative of a 500-plus year history of colonialism. We need to talk about popular history, telling better stories about where we got to where we are. And we also need to think about an alternative to disaster capitalism. We need disaster collectivism.